I call this meeting back into order. I do note that there is a motion of estimates from the House, and at some point the will of the committee will be needed to provide direction on that matter. But this is a resumption of meeting number 32, the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defence, which started on Friday, May the 21st, 2021. If interpretation is lost, please inform us immediately and we'll make sure that it is properly restored before continuing, because it's very important that everyone have a full opportunity to participate in these meetings. All members should address their comments through the chair, and when speaking, again, as much to remind myself as everyone else, please speak slowly and clearly. Some of the members' speed of speaking is actually making it really challenging for the interpreters to do their work, especially on very technical subjects. And when we're using acronyms and things like that, that makes it really difficult for them to do their work. So please, if you have a technical piece, that if you can share it in advance, I think that would be very helpful. And if not, then please make sure that you're speaking at a speed which would allow the interpreters the time they need to do the job that they do, which is very challenging, even at the best of times. All right, with regard to a speaking list, the clerk and I will do our best we can to maintain a consolidated order of speaking for all members, whether you're virtual or here in the room. So we are resuming the debate on Monsieur Barcelou-Duval's amendment, and Madame Vandenvelde had the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I continue the debate on the amendment, the block amendment on the motion that the Conservative members brought forward, I would like to note that there was a motion in the House. It was requesting that the minister come for the estimates, which I think committee members will note that the minister has always done. He, in fact, has always come when this committee has asked him to come to present and answer questions. And I can confirm that the minister is available before the deadline of June 10th to be able to come to the committee, should the committee request that. I also wanted to note that on Friday, I put a notice of motion to bring Justice Morris Fish. Now, that notice of motion I know didn't get to members, so in keeping with my 48 hours notice, that's why I know that the chair suspended also at the beginning. But I think it would be something that all committee members would find helpful. As you know, there is a requirement for a review of the National Defence Act, and that a year ago, the minister asked the former Supreme Court Justice Morris Fish to conduct a review of the military justice system. The minister has indicated publicly, and I do believe it's been sent to the clerk and soon to be sent out, that the minister plans to table that tomorrow, and there will be a technical briefing offered to all members of Parliament who are interested, and I think that will be going out to the members for the details and timing. But I would also think that this committee would want to hear from Justice Fish. This is a very, my understanding, important review, and I think that committee members would probably very much benefit from being able to ask questions and get his views on that report, particularly since Madame Arbour has also been tasked in her terms of reference to look at the military justice system. And I would note our next study that we had planned is on military justice. So I think that would be a very helpful thing for the committee. But I do note that right now we are still in a meeting that is continuously suspended, not adjourned, and that we are debating an amendment on a motion. I take note that there was a notice of motion, and I would imagine that my Conservative colleague will probably speak to that. I just wanted to say that I think that it would be very helpful for this committee to withdraw the motion that we're debating, the amendment and the motion that we're debating right now, and to immediately go to a fulsome study of the reports. I do believe that, and now I'm speaking on the motion that is currently before us, the amendment and the motion that's currently before us, because I can't speak on what might come, but I would say that in that motion it said, and this was May 28th, so it was last week, but it says that members are going to be limited in the amount of time that they can spend debating on recommendations in a report. I really believe, and in most of the committees that I have participated in here, I have had very, very good experiences with colleagues across to be able to come to consensus on recommendations. In fact, one of the committees that I've sat on is a consensus committee, the Subcommittee on International Human Rights. And we've been able to do tremendous work coming to a consensus. And sometimes that takes time. We have to really go back and forth, talk through each of the recommendations, make our case, and convince one another, and then come to that consensus. And I noted that we did that on the Uyghurs this last summer. We had extensive conversations around that in order to come to a unanimous consensus report. Most of the reports, when I chaired the Committee on Pay Equity, again, we made sure we came to a consensus, and it took time. And I just want to say that in addition to some of the other issues we've raised in, of course, the block amendment to the motion, one of the key problems is that I just would like to put to members, if there were ever a majority government and the majority decided in a committee that there was a limit, and in this case, an hour and 45 minutes, and it would be none now because, of course, the motion has been moot because it was supposed to be last Friday. But if there was a limit to the amount of time that members could actually spend debating and discussing a report, I think that, I mean, in a minority, maybe that's not so bad because you can go back and forth but if you do this and there's a majority government, then any committee report could be passed with very limited debate and it could just be voted. It's an up-down vote. So it's, a couple minutes of debate on the recommendation, boom, it goes to a vote. And I was chair of the was the founding chair of the Democracy Caucus, the All-Party Democracy Caucus. And I do actually implore committee members that we not set a precedent in this committee of a majority of the committee being able, ultimately the majority will be able to vote what they want anyway, but to have a majority say that you can only speak for X amount of time, and then it's just an automatic vote, I would say that that is not good. That is not democratic. And I'm very concerned that this committee is going in that direction with this block amendment to the current motion and any other that may possibly come forward. What I really think that this committee could do right now is if this motion is withdrawn, or if we just adjourn debate on this motion, and all we need is a majority to adjourn debate on this motion. So if we were to agree to adjourn debate, that would allow the committee to then have there are three reports. We have three reports right now that need to be debated. We could actually then go straight into debating, and one of them we're almost through. It's only a few recommendations left. We were almost finished. And that one is a study we started before Christmas. We could actually make sure that the work this committee has done, especially the one on mental health, which we had people who came to this committee, and it was not easy. It was hard for some of these people to speak and to take the time to relive their experiences. To not then have a report come out of that is not fair to those witnesses. And I would love to be able to stop this debate on this motion, go to those reports, get those reports done, have Justice Fish come, and that is also a fairly urgent thing because, of course, it's tabled tomorrow. Have Justice Fish come for one meeting, have the minister come to answer questions about the estimates, which again is about accountability, which is what the members opposite are talking about. They're talking about accountability. Well, accountability for spending is what the estimates are about. And I note that the deadline for that has been extended. So I imagine that that is something the opposition would like. And the minister, I have assurances that the minister is available to come. And we could do those two meetings. We could go to the reports. We still have, before the summer recess, we still have enough meetings that we can get those reports out and translated and hopefully be able to get them tabled in the House. And I guess at this point, I'm imploring the members opposite to really just put aside some of the dysfunction that's happened in this committee and look at what good we can do. And I do believe this committee can do good. I do. And I think we've heard some really, really important testimony. And it just hurts me that some of that testimony might not make it into a report or recommendations because we're stuck and we're at an impasse. And so my preference right now would be that the motion is withdrawn and that we then can talk about what we want to do next as a committee, including the reports, including bringing Justice Fish, including having some hearings on military justice. We know that every survivor that came forward talked about the justice system and how it needs to be reformed. And we have a generational opportunity here to be able to weigh in on that. And this is the moment, because we know that Madame Arbour is starting right now as part of her terms of reference on military justice. We have a moment right now as a committee to weigh in on that. And I really hope that the committee could see past some of the very undemocratic motions that are coming forward and really try to come to some kind of consensus. That's all I have to say, Madam Chair. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Madame Van de Belt. Mr. Bazan, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And, I find it a little rich coming from the parliamentary secretary that she's concerned about shutting down debate at a committee on a report that they don't want to see the light of day when they move closure at every whim in the House of Commons to shut down debate on important legislation. I think that this government is on track to moving closure a record number of times in parliamentary history. And so if the parliamentary secretary is sincere about fighting for democracy and parliamentary processes and decorum, then let's quit having closure motions by the government on legislation, often bills that have barely seen the light of day, never mind having significant amounts of debate on the substance of legislation that would impact all Canadians. And I'll just say this, is that, the Liberal members of this committee have spent hours and days in filibuster. The Liberal chair, she suspended this meeting now, this committee on this report 25 plus times. We've been in this meeting in suspension and actual filibuster since May the 21st. And so when you take in all the suspensions, just the suspensions that we've had, we're now over a month that we have been trying to deal with this report and have some more witnesses called, like Zita Estraves, and instead we've been spending a month in suspensions and filibusters. That is not democracy, that is obstruction, and it's contemptuous behavior by the government members. Now, I would just say that knowing that Zita Estraves must have some fairly important information because the Liberals have been complicit in the cover-up of the minister and the PMO on how things progressed after they found out on March 1st, 2018, about the sexual misconduct allegations against General Vance. And Zita Estraves was front and center as the one that carried that information from the Minister of National Defence, Minister Sagen, to Katie Telford, and the Liberals definitely don't want to have her up here at this committee. And because of this ongoing suspensions and filibusters and blocking the ability of committee to hear from key witnesses in this study, and knowing that the current motion before us, along with the amendment, is no longer valid because of dates have passed, I am going to withdraw that motion, Madam Chair, and I move the following motion: that the committee, in respect of the committee's study on addressing sexual misconduct issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of Defence Staff Jonathan Vance, A, the committee hear no further witnesses before a report to the House has been adopted, and B, the provisions of the motion adopted on Monday, April 12th, 2021, concerning a report to the House be supplemented as follows. 1, notwithstanding the motion adopted on Monday, April 12th, 2021 at 12 p.m., on Monday, June 7th, 2021, or if the committee is not then sitting immediately after the committee is next called to order, The proceedings before the committee shall be interrupted if required for the purposes of the motion adopted on Monday, April 12, 2021, and every question necessary for the disposal of the draft report, including on each paragraph and proposed recommendation, which has not been disposed of, shall be put forthwith and successively without amendment, provided that each member of the committee may speak once for 2 minutes on each proposed recommendation. The committee declines to request, pursuant to Standing Order 109, that the government table a comprehensive response to the report. 3, dissenting or supplementary opinions or recommendations shall be filed pursuant to Standing Order 108(1)B in both official languages no later than 4 p.m. on Wednesday, June the 9th, 2021. 4, the clerk and analyst be authorized to make such minor grammatical and editorial changes as may be necessary without changing the substance of the report. And 5, the clerk be instructed to inform the chair and vice chairs when the report is ready to present it to the House, so that the chair may present the report when the House next takes up routine proceedings, providing that in her absence, it be presented by one of the vice chairs. So, Madam Chair, I'll speak to that motion.
Okay, stand by. Unfortunately, we still have the amendment on the floor. That needs to be withdrawn as well. And then the motion before we can take something else on the floor, and then the main motion as well. So stand by a minute. Mr. Barcelo-Duval, since you were the mover of that amendment, do you wish to withdraw it?
Oui, Madame la...
Yes, Madam Chair. I agree to have the amendment withdrawn. And I'd also like to point out that I would like to take the floor on the new motion when the opportunity first arises, please.
All right, thank you very much. All right. And then to finish this off, Mr. Bazan, you need to ask the committee for unanimous consent to withdraw your original motion before we can go back and talk about the new motion.
Okay, I ask unanimous consent to withdraw the motion on the floor.
Any objections? No, looks good. All right, done.
Okay, and I will not bother moving that again since I've already read it into the records, if you're okay with that, Madam Chair.
Yes, that's fine.
Madam Chair, taking into consideration the debate that was ongoing for the last 10 plus days on that motion, and knowing that we want to get to a point of tabling a report in the House before we rise for summer recess, and realizing that we have only 4 weeks left, a maximum of 8 meetings counting this meeting here, unless we add more meetings to the schedule, if that's possible, knowing that there are limitations due to the available resources and other committees that are currently meeting. But I would implore, Madam Chair, that if the opportunity presented itself, that other committees have wrapped up for this session, that we take their times in respect of trying to get our work done. And as the Parliamentary Secretary earlier alluded to, we have this report on sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces, specifically surrounding the allegations against General Jonathan Vance and Admiral Art McDonald. But we also have our study on mental health, our study on COVID and the armed forces that we'd like to get finished, complete, and tabled, and then at that time move on to hearing from the Minister on supplemental estimates, as well as from Justice Fish on his statutory review of the National Defence Act as it relates to military justice. Now, the purpose of this motion is that it provides some clarity on how we go forward, and if the Liberals continue to talk out paragraphs and recommendations ad nauseum, then we need to be able to move into a format where we can still have debate. And so I'm still allowing each member in this motion would still allow each member of the committee to talk for 2 minutes on each paragraph or recommendation that is in the report that we have started to consider. I would think that that's more than ample time for concerns to be raised on a paragraph by paragraph, recommendation by recommendation basis, and would focus our efforts in coming to a decision on what is the best report to present to the House of Commons and ultimately to Canadians, and provide direction to the Government of Canada as well as to the Canadian Armed Forces. Now, I think that this is an easy path forward for us, and I would encourage members to support this so that we can get on to the drafting of the report on sexual misconduct in the armed forces. If the Liberals decide to filibuster this motion, which provides a timeline for us to actually getting a report tabled in the House of Commons before we recess, as it states in here that the dissenting opinions would have to be submitted to the committee no later than Monday, June the 7th, and Monday, Wednesday, June the 9th, excuse me, no later than 4 p.m., which would allow us to table this in the House of Commons either on June the 10th or June the 11th. And I would ask members to see this as being a way for us to get some solid recommendations into the government and to the Canadian Armed Forces. It will prove to Canadians that this committee has done more than just, as the Liberals like to accuse, is play politics, but yet all the evidence points to that their ongoing filibustering is actually the political games that have been played here, Madam Chair. And we know that ultimately, at the end of the day, we can come to a decision. If the Liberals decide to filibuster this motion, it proves a fact to everyone watching, as well as to those of us as committee members, that indeed they don't want a report to see the light of day, mainly because there was a concerted cover-up that was done between the Prime Minister's office, Katie Telford in particular, and the Minister of National Defence, Harjit Sajjan. And that because of their action and inaction, ultimately there is a failure to Operation Honor. There was a failure in protecting the women and men who serve in uniform. And the culture was allowed to fester and become more toxic than what had previously been even experienced. So, Madam Chair, I do encourage all members to look at this and accept this motion so that we can get on to actually finishing writing the report and get it tabled in the House of Commons within the next couple of weeks.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Bazan. Monsieur Barsoudou-Duval, s'il vous plaît.
Alors, merci.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairperson. As you noticed, as I said earlier, I agreed to withdraw the motion on the original motion from Mr. Bazan. Now, I must say that it is with some regret that whilst I have withdrawn the motion, or there was unanimous report for the withdrawal of the motion, as well as for the support of Mr. Bazan's current motion. But I've done this with some regret because I think that the committee could have done a much better job had we not attended interminable filibusters as we've seen over the past couple of months. And that has put the committee in an impasse and prevented it from doing its proper job, and I find that particularly a sad state of affairs. Now, I've heard the calls for democracy on the part of the government, the Liberals, vis-à-vis this motion that has been moved, because it may shorten or curtail or limit debate. But for my part, in normal circumstances, I would be very apprehensive about this kind of motion. I can tell you that in this particular situation, having gone through and experienced what we have over the past couple of weeks, I'd venture to say past couple of months, the Liberals' arguments leave me all the more incredulous. Because I will say this out loud, Madam Chairperson, that any offer of reasonable cooperation so that the House can adopt this report before it adjourns. Now, I won't hide the fact that I've had an overdose of filibusters and I've seen enough of them to not be naive enough to give them an opportunity to block the committee's work once again. We could have done a good job. We could have welcomed witnesses that would have been crucial for the work of the committee and the studies that were ongoing. Unfortunately, we didn't succeed. We may still have an opportunity to debate the contents of the report, and it's crucial, and I don't know how many times I've repeated this before this committee, but I'm sure you'll understand how sincere I am in my remarks. It's absolutely crucial that a report be tabled before the House, and I think that we're going to do our utmost such that the report will be tabled. And I think that this motion will not mean per se that people can voice their opinions. Yes, there is time set aside for debate, but also time for a dissenting report, for example, for those who don't agree with the contents, and that may very well be the case for me. So for that reason, I think we need to put an end to this sad state of affairs, these filibusters, so that the committee can get back on track in view of the current circumstances. And yes, I will support the motion as tabled.
All right. Merci, Monsieur Borsellou-Duval. On to Mr. Baker, please.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And so I wanted to start by responding to some of the things that Mr. Bazan said just a few moments ago. I find those things completely objectionable. And I'm going to quote, Mr. Bazan referred to government members, which includes me and my colleagues, as performing what he called contemptuous behavior by debating motions that he has presented repeatedly at the last minute. He accused us of being complicit in the cover-up. First of all, to be able to allege that, you'd have to prove that there was a cover-up, which Mr. Bazan desperately has tried to do but has not been successful at. And I can appreciate why he's frustrated given the number of committee meetings he's wasted trying to do that. But then even if he had proven a cover-up, which he hasn't, then you'd have to prove that we were complicit before accusing us of doing so. And neither of those things are true. I'm incredibly disappointed. And I'm actually wondering, Madam Chair, if that's even in order to say such things at a committee or in Parliament. The third thing is he's referred to filibustering. And it's interesting because Conservative members, and Mr. Bazan in leading them, has continuously introduced motions at the last minute that call for witnesses that, in many cases, that we have heard from already to come back over and over again to answer the same questions we have asked and heard answers to over and over again from those same witnesses, from other witnesses. And what I find shocking is that Mr. Bazan is completely comfortable wasting the committee's time on that political finger pointing and on recalling witnesses on those same topics that we've already debated and heard from them on. But now he has the gall to suggest that the Liberal members are not allowed to spend time in committee debating the very motions that he introduced. So I wanted to respond to those points, Chair, because I found them all objectionable. I do think using words such as contemptuous behavior and complicit in the cover-up, I'm shocked that that's in order, if it is in order. Going back to the motion that Mr. Bazan has introduced, I agree that this committee needs to present a report, a fulsome, thoughtful report that actually makes recommendations to the government on what to do to fix the problem of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the armed forces. That's what we should be doing. In fact, that is what the government members have been fighting for meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, while Mr. Bazan and his colleagues decided instead to play political games and introduce further motions at the last minute to call witnesses and point fingers and try to grab headlines. yeah, we should be issuing a report. And the way you issue a report, and I don't have to tell the members of this committee how that's done, because they've all been part of it many times over in this committee and in others. The way you issue a report in the House of Commons, in committees in the House of Commons, is that you work together, you meet, and you find consensus, because that is the only way to build a report that reflects the will of the committee. What you don't do is you don't say, well, you know, we wasted months and months and months of this committee's time pointing fingers at the Liberals, unsuccessfully trying to repeat to people that there's a cover-up, which there isn't. And no, just because you repeat the word cover-up hundreds of times doesn't make it true. So, but Mr. Bazan has tried that tactic unsuccessfully, and now he's frustrated. And so now what he's trying to do is make up for lost time that he wasted by introducing a motion that basically requires us to ram a report out of this committee, which will not have the consensus that you need. And because it won't do that, it won't speak for what we've heard at the committee. It'll speak for what some members think they heard at the committee. And instead, it won't do justice to the people who we should be trying to help, which are the victims of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the Canadian Armed Forces. So yes, of course we should be issuing a report. That's what you've heard from the government members over and over and over again over the past many weeks and months, while Mr. Bazan and his colleagues played political games. But now this motion would make a farce of that report. That's not a report. This is a way for Mr. Bazan to say, well, I ticked the box. There's some sort of document that came out of this committee that says report on it. That's not. The victims of sexual assault and sexual harassment deserve way better than that. It should be a report that actually reflects the will of the committee, that's thoughtful and debated and considered. And by limiting the amount of time that members can actually speak to the issues, come on. That's not the way in which you create a report on a complex, serious topic where you're serious about actually defending the interests of the people who are victims of the sexual assault and sexual harassment. That's just not how you do it. And I'm surprised I even have to take the time to explain this. The members here should know that. So this is something that is what I find also objectionable is that in the motion itself that Mr. Bazan has presented, he's limiting the MP's ability to debate the report. Like, never mind the fact that limiting the amount of time to debate the report is not going to lead to a good report, because members knowing that, who disagree with the members who are speaking, instead of working towards consensus, can just ignore it and then vote down the way they wish. So they have no interest in finding consensus, no interest in working together. It's like pretending that some of the members weren't even at the committee the whole time. Just let them have their 2 minutes, and then I'm going to ram through the report I want. So not only is that bad for the quality of the report, the caliber of the report, but it's completely undemocratic. And as Ms. Vandenbeld raised earlier on, imagine what happens when there's a majority government of any political stripe. Like, imagine, this is a motion that once you pass this here, if we were to pass Mr. Bazan's motion here at this committee, that sets a precedent that any majority government can just basically ran through any report and claim it's the will of the committee without it actually being the will of the committee. Because if a government has a majority government, they'll have the majority of the members on the committee and they can vote through anything they want. And I don't know. I mean, I don't, as a member of the governing party, I don't like that. But if I was in an opposition party, I certainly wouldn't like that. Especially if I didn't think I might be in the majority. So I'm really shocked that Mr. Bazan is willing to set this kind of precedent. And I'm shocked that he's wanting to limit MPs' ability to debate. He had time to play political games for months and months and months on this issue, but he doesn't have time to debate the report, which is what the victims of sexual assault and sexual harassment actually deserve. So I'm incredibly disappointed. I think when you limit debate on a topic like this, you're not allowing the members of this committee who've heard the testimony from so many experts and others to be able to bring into the report what it is that they actually heard. And I think we heard a tremendous amount that was incredibly important, that has to be in that report, that has to be heard, that has to be documented, and most importantly, that has to be used, not just documented for the sake of documentation, but documented so that insights can be drawn, so that the conclusions, the recommendations, I should say, of the report actually reflect what we learned. And so when I think about some of the things that we learned, and there's so much we could that needs to be in that report, but I think, for example, of what we heard from a member, a survivor, and a CAF member who presented actually to the committee, to the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, and I wanted to share this with you. This is the kind of thing that should be in that report and should be debated. And her thoughts and her insights should be included. And le nom de cette députée, pardon.
The name of the member of the Canadian Armed Forces who testified before the Status of Women Committee was Heather McDonald, and she said the following: "It's even more complicated in the Canadian Marines. If an incident occurs at sea or in a foreign port, for example, there are no police officers aboard the ship. And if an investigation is required, it's up to our leaders and our captain to go about the discipline hearings and investigations. And of course, that significantly limits the opportunity for admissible evidence to be heard and to help the victim get justice before the courts. In most cases, victims will in fact experience a backlash and be hurt more than the actual perpetrators of the crimes. And I think that her last sentence is of particular import, and that is victims will experience a backlash that is even greater than the perpetrators when they file a complaint. And that is why most are reluctant to blow the whistle and report these incidents. That is one of the issues that we have heard again and again and again before this committee. It's one of the issues that we need to tackle head on in this committee, and our report should include recommendations that would help, at the very least, to address this issue. But no, Mr. Bizan doesn't want to do that. He just wants to ram this report through to be able to say, oh, look, we've written a report and let's move on to the next item on the agenda. Well, I don't think so. I think that testimony such as that gives us a rare insight into that we need to capitalize on and include in our report to ensure that the recommendations that come from this report are faithful to the evidence the victims have shared with us as to what must be done to address this situation in the Canadian Armed Forces. Now, let me continue with what Mr. Heather McDonald said. We need, and I quote, to address the situation, we need to ensure that this workplace is more welcoming and safe for women. The movement, Me Too, really shed a light on the problems of gender equality within our society. The Army has amplified the issues, given that women are a minority in the Canadian Armed Forces. Minority ends up attracting attention to itself to the extent that we are often looked at with a fine-tooth comb, much more than men, and scrutinized. Women have to jump through hoops when it comes to the Canadian Armed Forces, and those who are empathetic or caring are deemed like mothers and maternal, which is something that should not be a trait in the Canadian Armed Forces, apparently, and is a pejorative term. So I'll stop there with that quote. But what Ms. McDonald is basically saying in her testimony is, and listen, I don't know how many times in this committee we have heard witnesses raise this issue of workplace culture. And that is just one tiny example of this. And I won't say small. I shouldn't say small. It's a big example. It's a major example of this workplace culture issue that is so flagrant. Now, if this committee is really serious about addressing the problem of the workplace culture in the Canadian Armed Forces, well, we need to debate what we heard and write a report that, in fact, places a stock and value on resolving this issue. And Mr. Bézan's motion doesn't do that. Oh, far from it. It's a far cry from that. Basically, it's a way of avoiding any debate. Each member will have 1 or 2 minutes to debate the issue, and wham bam, thank you, ma'am, the report is going to be published and drafted. That's a joke. It's a complete farce, this motion. And let me continue with what Ms. McDonald said, and I quote, when she testified before the Standing Committee on the Status of Women. And I quote, "There's a phenomenon that we must understand that some call the old boys club. Most of the time, the men deny its existence. It's when we are in dangerous situations, we count on those fellow servicemen and women to protect us, to cover our backs and to keep us alive. And this helps to build strong relationships. And that is highly desirable for our organisation," end of quote. So once again, Ms. McDonald, who is a survivor of sexual misconduct, has speaking once again about the workplace culture and its failings. And once again, we need to get a handle on the subtleties and nuances of this problem and include them in our report. We can't just gloss over it and talk for a minute or two about these issues and just ram such a report through. That's not fair, it's not proper, and it doesn't do justice for the victims. Women like Heather McDonald, among others, have testified before committees, spoken openly and publicly. Those women are incredibly brave to have spoken up. And Mr. Bézan's motion, well, what's the purpose of his motion? Basically, it states that, well, we're going to write a report, but not a report that reflects what we've heard, what these women have told us, and what really must be included by way of recommendations with a view to resolving the issue of sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces. So, Madam Chairperson, I am obviously wholeheartedly against this motion. I'm disappointed by Mr. Bézan's remarks. I'm disappointed that he moved such a motion in the first place. And as I said at the outset, it's undemocratic. It creates a very dangerous precedent for future governments because the majority party will be able to, in government, will be able to write whatever they want in a report without bearing in mind the perspective of the opposition if we create this precedent by adopting this motion here today. So at the end of the day, we're here to address the issue of sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces, and in order to achieve that, we need to dedicate enough time to write a top-quality report. This motion stands in the way of that. It's basically lip service to writing a report when we're not intending whatsoever to write a fulsome report that does justice and honour to the victims of sexual harassment, of sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces. Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson.
Mr. Baker, Mr. Spengeman.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. And perhaps to begin, I would just like to thank you for your leadership on this committee over the past months. It's clear that some partisanship has taken hold. And thank you for keeping us on the rails, for keeping the conversation going. I think we are talking about extremely important issues, even though we have different visions now, clearly, in terms of what needs to be done and what how to arrive at the conclusions before the end of the parliamentary term. And perhaps today we'll offer an opportunity to get to a better space. I would like to support the comments that were made early on by my colleague, Ms. Vandenbelt, with respect to the intersection of this topic with the issue of military justice. And she mentioned the potential appearance of Mr. Justice Fish, and I would support that. I think as time is ticking and as we're rapidly approaching the end of the parliamentary term, if we can create connection points and synergies that stress the horizontality and systematicity of the issue of sexual misconduct into the domain of military justice, we should absolutely take advantage of that opportunity. Even though the clock is ticking, as I said, and time is being used now to discuss the different visions that we have in front of us. Madam Chair, in response to Mr. Bazan's motion, I mean, it's very clear that Mr. Bazan and colleagues of his have a particular view, and they've made certain allegations, and they've been spending the last few weeks trying to substantiate those allegations by chasing after one more witness, one more statement that would allow the conclusion that what they say is accurate. In the meantime, the clock is burning, ticking away. And we have a different vision, a different narrative, a different account of what needs to be done, which is to solve the issue, the systematic issue of sexual misconduct in the armed forces in a deeper way. And it's easy for the opposition colleagues to say, well, you're filibustering. No, we're not filibustering. What we are doing is putting on the table the ideas, the visions, the experiences, not only, most importantly, of serving and former members of the Canadian Forces, of people who aspire to join the Canadian Forces, but equally, as I've tried to do over the past number of sessions, of work that's been done elsewhere. Work that's been done in other jurisdictions with militaries that are similarly structured to ours, that are under democratic control, and where the issue of sexual misconduct all the way up to sexual assault has equally caused concern, equally led to initiatives, and in some cases, in several cases, the work has been done. Colleagues in those jurisdictions at the parliamentary and executive level have been able to get to the same side of the table, have created reports, high quality reports with recommendations and accounts that are granular enough to warrant serious consideration by this committee. In some cases, our experience has been cited elsewhere in a good way, in a salutary way, but it's very clear that in Canada, a lot of work remains to be done, urgent work, and that those countries that are working in parallel with us are going to look to see if Canada will follow suit, will take a leadership role on this issue, will solve these questions and issues urgently. So that's one thing I've been trying to do under the description by opposition colleagues as filibustering. Mr. Basalou-Duval's motion, which has since been withdrawn, or the amendment, stated very clearly that with the study underway, there was an expectation that this committee take cognizance of new facts, and new facts come to us in the form of witness testimony, but also in the form of very often comparable experience from other jurisdictions, particularly countries like the Five Eyes, whom we work very closely on questions of military cooperation, security, and intelligence, including the UK, as I've highlighted in recent interventions, and also New Zealand and others as well. What I also did in my last intervention before the committee was to draw attention to the work that we had done as parliamentarians in a very different way in the 42nd Parliament. In a much less partisan way. The report that we issued then was not directly related to sexual misconduct. It was related to equity, diversity, and inclusion in the armed forces, but there were sections on sexual misconduct and the issue of the sexualized culture in the military, and some of the witnesses that appeared then appeared before us as well. But the outcome was different. The outcome was a report where colleagues had opportunity to consider among themselves in a nonpartisan way a series of recommendations and approaches that we made to government, and with respect to which a government response was requested. There wasn't a dissenting report, so that means that even though it was a majority government at the time, if colleagues had disagreed with what was put forward, they would have had the opportunity to voice those concerns in a dissenting report. But the committee spoke with one voice. So I just wanted to, in this intervention, Madam Chair, put to the committee the consideration that it's time to move out of the partisan divisions and find a way to work together fairly quickly, because time is tight. It's not impossibly tight, but it's we're at a stage where we now need to make the right decisions with respect to this report. I think it's incredibly important that colleagues, as my friend colleague Mr. Baker has outlined, have an opportunity to debate, not in the form of a 2-minute statement on each paragraph or recommendation, which, by the way, if we take that at face value, would utterly be inconsistent with the time frame that's recommended, because the motion recommends that we be done on, as I read it, on the 7th of June. That level of debate, each member of the committee making a 2-minute statement on each recommendation or paragraph potentially, it would just, first of all, be a series of monologues without ability to really interact with each other, because we can't amend the recommendations or paragraphs. But it would also take more time than the timeline of the 7th would allow. So my strong recommendation is that, and also thirdly, Madam Chair, it eliminates your ability to act as chair and to really exercise discretion in debate among colleagues, to guide a debate in a very complex setting to a productive conclusion on recommendations or textual paragraphs. If we simply vote paragraphs up or down after 2-minute monologues, we don't create a report. We create a run-on series of statements that may or may not solve issues, but it certainly, we wouldn't raise the chances of them solving issues, because we haven't had the ability to either combine motions, to amend motions, to reconsider motions, to look at experience from elsewhere to see, if the recommendation hits the right tenor, to prioritize them in terms of timelines. In other words, what needs to be done first? What should the government most urgently take account of to really get on top of this issue quickly? And time is of the essence, not only parliamentary time in terms of getting this report finished before we rise for the summer, but most importantly, because it requires such urgent attention with respect to the protection of members of the Canadian Forces who are currently serving, and our efforts to do two things: to forestall or to prevent additional cases of misconduct, and to allow, in those instances where sexual misconduct has happened, victims to come forward in a much more empowered structure and with greater oversight, independent oversight that takes account of the evidence that we've heard with respect to senior ranks and the cultural differences between various ranks within the armed forces. So very, very important considerations. To do a quick slapdash up and down approach in the context of a week, in the course of a week, where the real heavy lifting, I've described this in other interventions as sort of the tip of the iceberg being the cases that we've actually looked at, the high profile as they were, the important cases of misconduct that have really taken the entire country's attention with respect to the problem. That's one portion, but the massive issues below the iceberg, or the lower part of the iceberg that's hidden, is the system itself, the system that empowers people like the former Chief of Defence Staff to say that he owns the Canadian Forces National Investigative Service in 2015. How can this happen? How can one senior ranking officer of the Canadian Forces be so empowered institutionally, misempowered is probably the better term, that he would claim that he owns the entire National Investigative Service? That's the system challenge. That's not a challenge I've heard any thoughts or recommendations on from opposition colleagues who are now saying, well, we should find another witness who may have an additional sentence to add. Let's do the real work. Let's do the work that's the work on the iceberg. Let's chip apart the iceberg, change the culture, look at those countries that have done it well, incorporate their experience and their testimony, prioritize the emotional, the deep scarring emotional impact of the messages that came from us, directly from former and current serving members of the armed forces. That needs to be front and center. That can't be done in a report that's voted up and down in a quick session with a basket of recommendations that we've not even had the opportunity to relate to each other or to prioritize or just to discuss in any meaningful way. I appreciate Mr. Bizan's concern that we do need to get this report out. I think it's incredibly important. And I said earlier, no reports in this committee's recent history will be more important than this one. It needs to be finalized, it needs to be published, but it needs to have impact. To publish something that falls flat on expectations and impact is not worthy of this committee's mandate and effort. So for that reason, I hope that the motion that's on the table now will give us a pathway to a potential amendment or to discussion or to a much more constructive approach where we can actually sit down as a committee on the same side of the table, with the problem being on the opposite side of the table, and find a pathway to make those changes that are so utterly urgently needed. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll leave it there. I've got additional thoughts that will take us into more detail with respect to other experiences and insights that we may inject into the consideration of the recommendations if and when we get to them in a meaningful way. But for the moment, I'll turn it back to you with my thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spengeman. On to Mr. Bagnall, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and appreciate the opportunity to speak to this motion. When the motion was first presented, you know, I thought it was an improvement. I thought it was a step forward, and I was hoping, as Mr. Spengeman just said, that it left room so we could amend it in such a way that all the parties would agree that we could move forward in a cooperative way. But then, and I have a number of things to say on the motion, at least four. But before that, as Mr. Bizan does at times, presents, you know, inappropriate preambles to the motions. And so I just have to set the record straight on the comments he made in preamble to the motion. First of all, remember where we came from, that there was an email. The person was anonymous. They didn't want their name put forward. They didn't want the information. They didn't give permission for the information to put forward. So we have an email with that no one knows what's in it, and it's anonymous. It was studied. You know, it was reported immediately to the investigative officials who investigated as far as they could. Case done. But then the Conservatives started doing motions to bring all sorts of witnesses about those emails. And the Liberals agreed for a time, even though it wasn't studying the major things that the witnesses, the experts, and the survivors had told us we should be studying: the culture, the reprisals for reporting, the chain of command. It wasn't all on that. It was on an email that no one knew anything about and that had already been investigated. And so finally the Liberals said enough, and you know, stopped wasting the time of the committee on keep bringing forward motions for either to even bring back the same witnesses on that email that no one knew what was in, or to bring other emails that were not necessarily appropriate, so we could get back to what we should be discussing, which has some possibility in the new motion. And I appreciate the things that Mr. Bizan mentioned in his preamble that we should move on with. But going back to what the facts were, remember that, you know, that situation was investigated fully as far as it could go, because they weren't given permission or the information to do anything else. But what came up since subsequent to that motion was at the time of General Vance's appointment, that there were actually two serious allegations that the dogged research of the media had found out. I think it was the Global News and Toronto Star. And General Vance was still appointed. As I said, this isn't where I wanted to go on any of these past witnesses. I wanted to get on the things that the survivors wanted us to get on with. But those who were seriously thinking of calling more witnesses, Mr. Barcelona-Duval talked about more witnesses in his preamble, would really have to change the witness list to those that found out at the time about those two investigations and why was General Vance still appointed. One investigation, the military police ended it, announced they were ending it the day he was made the commander-in-chief. And 4 days later, it was ended, and they said under access to information, I have no idea who filed it, but that they were under pressure. Now that is serious, could be serious allegations. So if you're talking about witnesses, that's who the types of witnesses would have been. The other investigation into General Vance at the time was referred to the head of to Mr. Novak. Very similar to what happened in the email in 2018. But in 2018, it was investigated as far as it could go. But in the case of Mr. Novak, he said he also, the very same process, went to Mr. Fadden. But Mr. Fadden said there's no record of complaint or current investigation. So if there wasn't, then there needed to be one. But the National Security Advisor says he never did that investigation. So if that investigation wasn't done, why was Mr. Mr. Vance appointed? So if you really wanted to go back and do witnesses, then unlike in Mr. Bizan's preamble, those are the witnesses you would call that recently came to light that was more serious. And as I said, that's not my area of interest. It's getting on with the future. But since that story came out, there was even more. The outgoing Chief of Defense Staff, General Tom Lawson, said he was crystal clear. No allegation related to misconduct by Vance at Gagetown was brought over to him at any time, including while he was helping find his replacement, the Chief of Staff. And he said he wasn't fuzzy at all. He would have looked into it. And subsequently, more people have come forward. The Vice Chief of Defense Staff, Guy Thibault, saying they were never told either. And so those are the types of things that the people that thought that other motion was appropriate, if they were serious, then they would have changed the witnesses to the serious allegations that were actually found later. But as the Liberals have been saying all along, the important thing is to get on with what the experts and what the survivors have been telling us needs to be done, and have a serious debate, not a 2-minute debate, on the very complex things that need to be done, need to be recommended. And good examples are that, for instance, the administrative changes that were made, in some cases were very good, but obviously, as Mr. Garrison's pointed out in the past, and I've pointed out, there were many, many, many hundreds of incidences still going on related to sexual misconduct. And so it's not working. It may be working to some extent. We listed at the last meeting for over an hour the things the government has done, but still, obviously, a lot more needs to be done. But it's very complex, obviously, when there's that many things have been done that may have made progress forward in some areas. But if it's too simplistic an answer, then obviously it's not going to make progress on that. So that's why I think, and I've said this at almost every meeting, that's where we need to be just having serious debate, because they're not easy issues. There's a saying that for every complex problem, there's a simple answer, and it's wrong. So that's why we need to have more than a 2-minute input onto each item. Whether it's 2 minutes on a paragraph, does that paragraph do justice to the witnesses? If not, do you just get to say 2 minutes and that's it? If it's on a recommendation, obviously these are very serious changes of direction for an organization, a military. Some of these recommendations is 2 minutes serious, as both I think Yvonne and myself have said, either in this meeting or previous meetings. How seriously is anyone going to take a report where you've had 2 minutes to discuss the paragraph, 2 minutes each to discuss the paragraph or the recommendation? You know, it's said many times that the purpose of this report or the study is to hold the government to account. So how can on this motion, how could you hold the government to account if the government doesn't get to do a response? Why would we not want to have the government respond to the various recommendations? And why would not the government, who's already taking a lot of steps, but is in the middle of taking some more with Louise Arbour, et cetera, to make sure that what the survivors and what the experts said are included in the report and the recommendations and the things that they are doing. If that's not included in the report. And then if you have a major report like this with so many recommendations, and I was hoping, similar to what Ms. Vandeveld said, that we could some way initially come to a way of agreeing on the ones we all agree on and get that part done. But if not, when you have only 2 minutes and you don't know what's going to go through, is 48 hours really a reasonable time for a consenting report with all the things that paragraphs that may be inaccurate or recommendations that may not need further input? Also on the limiting of debate, I'm just wondering how the NDP or the Bloc would feel if, you know, in the future, if this precedent passes, if in the future, if either there's a Liberal or Conservative majority, if with they'll get 2 minutes per person input on major recommendations that could totally go against their party philosophy, against their principles, but they get 2 minutes to, in fact, think of the things that we're debating at length right now. For instance, on the Broadcasting Act, we only had 2 minutes to deal with the recommendation there. Would people think that was appropriate? And the last thing I would say at this time is that you know, when on this particular part of the procedure, which is I think where we could come to some agreement and some discussion on, because it's a very serious change in procedure. When I was chair of PROC, the Conservatives and the NDP spent several months debating a change in procedure because they didn't feel it was appropriate. And so when you get, they made it pretty apparent time and time again how important it is to not change procedures without all party consent. So I'll leave it at that for now. And and the last thing I would say, because it'll be related to my next comments, is that on the serious recommendations and serious paragraphs, if we have more than 2 minutes input, we're going to have to make them now during this debate. So I assume all committee members that have some serious input on either paragraphs or recommendations unless that is changed, over the discussion of this motion, will put all their input into the recommendations or paragraphs in which they have more than 2 minutes input to make their viewpoint, because this is the only time they're going to be able to make it. Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you, Mr. Bagnall. Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. As my colleagues indicated, I'm surprised at Mr. Bézan's motion. Indeed, by limiting members' speaking time, that will prevent us from doing our work in a proper and effective and efficient manner. We've heard from witnesses in a number of meetings. witnesses who've reminded us just how important it is to change this state of affairs. And I get the sense that this motion is a way of usurping us of our role as members. We've spent 2 minutes and we've done our job, and that's clearly not the case. Moreover, by not allowing a government response, this report will not be a way of changing things. It proves once again that this is an opposition manoeuvre to try and say, well, we tried, but they didn't want to have a bar of it. And that is quite simply flies in the face of the truth. Now, the flip side is what we can do as a committee is to focus on victims, on survivors, and stop trying to score political points. Once again, all members of the Canadian Armed Forces should be able to feel safe and respected in their workplace. Doing away with sexual harassment and sexual misconduct and fostering a safe workplace for each and every serviceman and woman is a priority, a top priority for us. An independent, arm's-length, exhaustive review of programs, procedures, and the current workplace culture in the CAF and Department of National Defence would, as a consequence, be launched, and the purpose of which would be to shed a light on the sexual harassment and sexual misconduct codes, would determine any obstacles to reporting inappropriate behaviour, assessing the relevance of any such reports, and to make recommendations on how to best prevent and eradicate sexual harassment and misconduct. Sorry, Mr. Robillard, could you please just raise your microphone just a tad? Just a little higher? Or higher? Yes, okay. Is that okay? Yes, it is. So these are the kind of concrete steps that we can take to change this toxic workplace culture in the Canadian Armed Forces. And to this end, we will also review the recruitment, training, performance assessment, assignment and promotion system of the Canadian Armed Forces, as well as policies, procedures and practices that are in place in the military justice system, with a view to dealing with such allegations. Now, moreover, this review will assess any progress made vis-à-vis the recommendations contained in the external review on sexual misconduct and harassment in the Canadian Armed Forces. The mandate, independence, the hierarchical structure of the response centre on sexual misconduct will also be subject to review. These are concrete ways that will help us to change the culture in the Canadian Armed Forces. The author of the interim report will submit it to the Minister of National Defence and to the Deputy Minister, as well as to the Chief of Defence Staff. The final report review will be released by the Minister 10 days after it is received and then forwarded on to the Prime Minister. I don't believe that Mr. Bézin's motion needs to be thrown out. I hope that he's open to amendments so that we can make progress and headway, Madam Chairperson.
Beaucoup, Monsieur Robillard. On to Mr. Baker, please. Oh, you're next, Madame Vanderbilt.
Madam Chair, is it my turn or is it Madam Vanderbilt who goes next?
You can give Madame Vanderbilt your turn if you'd like, Mr. Baker. Or
Sure.
you can go after her. Okay,
Sure.
that's very gentlemanly. Thank you very much. Okay, Madame Vandenbelt, go ahead.
Okay. No, thank you very much, Mr. Baker, and thank you, Madam Chair. I know that it's a little more difficult when I'm in the room about exactly where I am in the order, but I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I note once again in this motion, as I mentioned about the previous motion, that limiting the ability of members to 1 to 2 minutes, no amendments, and an up-down vote on recommendations that have come from witnesses who took the time to come to this committee on what are very complex issues. I mean, there are many different solutions that have been proposed by different witnesses on what can be done to improve not just what we're able to do for survivors, but also how to prevent it in the first place. And to be in a situation where, as I've mentioned before, a report over 60 pages long, to just not be able to discuss between us, this idea of a round, like 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute, and then boom, we vote. Well, that's not a conversation, Madam Chair. We have to be able to go back and forth. We have to be able to come to a compromise. And I'll just say again on that aspect of it, I think this is a very, very bad precedent, because we all know as members that the real work in Parliament happens in committees. We all, especially those of us who've been here for a number of years, we all know, we have examples in committees that we've sat of reports where we were able to get past our political differences and listen to what the witnesses have told us and come up with some very, very good reports in this place. And I would hate that the report writing part of our job were to be subject to the same kinds of political limitations and considerations that other aspects of our work are done. This is where we actually can come together and really listen to Canadians and report to Parliament, and then ask the government to respond to that report. And that's probably the most cynical part of this. I know my colleagues have mentioned, but the most cynical part of this motion is that not only is it going to be no amendments, no very limited debate, up-down vote, where a majority can just push through whatever they want, but at the end of the day, to not ask for the government to respond to the report. This is what accountability is, Madam Chair, to ask the government, because not wanting the government to respond is akin to saying, well, we're going to be putting this through, but we don't actually want the government to take action on this. We don't want the government to have to either say yes, no to the different recommendations and explain why. And Madam Chair, I would go back to the fact that we've had exceptional witnesses. And it is true, yes, in the beginning of the report, it was supposed to be 3 days, and it was supposed to be on a very limited topic. But like many committees, when the witness testimony comes in, and we know that nothing can be taken out of context. And as we started looking at the context, as we started hearing from witnesses, as this issue became more and more clear to members, and we started calling more witnesses. I mean, we had Madame Deschamps here. That is significant. And we've had multiple academics. We've had several witnesses that have literally spent their life's work on this topic and gave us their ideas. And to then say that we're just going to take 1 to 2 minutes on the recommendations that these witnesses took the time to come here and express to us is a disservice to those witnesses. And, I just like to go through here some of the kinds of recommendations that we've heard from these witnesses. The recommendations that we're talking about, that we're just going to up-down vote after 2 minutes of discussion. There's a lot of really, really difficult, important, complicated, nuanced, complex things here. And I'll give you some examples. So, members will recall that I've spoken previously about some of the recommendations that we've heard from witnesses, both in this committee, but also in the Status of Women Committee, and also recommendations that we've heard, I think, as individual members from people who have very, very thoughtfully come to talk to us. And I can tell you, and I know Madam Chair and others here have had some really hard conversations in the last 4 months. And we have listened. And there I mentioned, there have been some conversations and some things that I've heard that have kept me awake, and that it's not easy. And what we need is to give those recommendations that came from our witnesses the thoughtfulness, the same thoughtfulness when we're debating them as they did when they presented them. And I'm going to just go through and talk about some of those recommendations. These are not necessarily recommendations that are in the draft report. These are things that we heard from witnesses and that we've heard through various committees. So the section of recommendations, I've bundled them. This particular section are around culture change in the Canadian Armed Forces. We know that culture change is needed. The things that are valued and the things that are seen as peripheral are really important. And the way in which Canadian Armed Forces members interact with one another, the things that they learn, what is something that will be rewarded, what is something that I need to, if you're a Canadian Armed Forces member, that they feel that they need to not speak out on or speak out on, what is the reaction that they get when they do so? How do people who are not the normative masculine warrior normative typecast, how do those people experience their time in the Canadian Armed Forces? And I would venture, Madam Chair, this is just as harmful to men who don't want to participate in this kind of culture. It is just as limiting to men to typecast and it accentuates certain characteristics as being a good soldier, good aviator, good sailor, and certain characteristics as being weak or not in tune somehow with the Canadian Armed Forces and the culture that is there, and the things that people learn. And we've heard even this week really hard testimony and hard discussions about the Royal Military College, about early on in a career, what young people who are joining to serve their country, who are joining to protect, the motivation for people to join the Canadian Armed Forces overwhelmingly, and I'm not a veteran, but I know we have a veteran in the room and many more listening. I really believe that it is to protect Canadians, to protect other people, to serve our country, to be honorable. These are the values, and when that isn't something that they find when they get there, that is not an easy thing. And I can only imagine, and just from listening, and I know in the last few months, we've been doing a lot of listening, and these are not easy problems. And so I have a series of recommendations here that I've picked up throughout the course of the last 4 months that I think I'd like to read into the record. So first of all, recommending the appointment of a non-Canadian Armed Forces member to conduct inquiries into sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces and make recommendations. Well, this, Madam Chair, this is something we heard early on. It's exactly the reason that we brought Madame Arbour, but also General Carignan to actually implement this. Madame Arbour, for the first time, we have somebody who is outside of the chain of command, who is outside of the Canadian Armed Forces, who is going to be looking at the how. And we know that Madame Deschamps, and she testified here, we know that she identified very, very significantly the problem, and she identified that this had to be done outside of the Canadian Armed Forces. And I think that for the we've heard now from the Acting Chief of Defence Staff, we've heard from many members, very senior members on the departmental side and the Canadian Armed Forces, that Madame Arbour's recommendations, and they're not recommendations in a generic sense. This is a roadmap. This is the how. That it couldn't have come from within the department, within the CAF. The how to do this, we tried that. We did try that. And I do think that people made honest attempts to try to implement things, but it has to come from outside. And that is what Madame Arbour is doing. And I don't think that we can underestimate the significance of the acting chief of the defense staff saying that a former Supreme Court justice and her recommendations are going to be not just implemented at the end, but that every month, we heard the acting chief say every month she is going to be reporting, and we have now a new institution within that is going to be implementing as the recommendations come in. It is with General Carignan. This isn't something where we're just going to wait for another report. This is a roadmap that, and you heard the minister say, it will be binding. And this is something that we're going to be implementing as we go, with General Carignan in a position to not only take those recommendations, but look across all of the Canadian Armed Forces and Department of National Defense and look at unifying all of the different pieces that are out there so that we actually do make a difference. And Madam Chair, I'm seeing a significant moment right now where I do believe that we have a real opportunity, and this often happens in periods of crisis, and because of those who have spoken out, because of those who have come forward, we are now in a very, very good position to really, really make a difference. And I think this committee really could be focused on that. Secondly, we also have Justice Fish's report coming out, which I'll talk about a little bit later after we're able to see what Justice Fish actually recommends. The next one here recommends approaching the issue of behavioral change in the Canadian Armed Forces with a top-to-bottom approach, examining individuals, culture, values, and attitudes. This may be one of the most important recommendations, Madam Chair, because what this recommendation does is it actually talks about the values. And when you talk about culture, what we're really talking about are values and attitudes of individuals. And that's not to say that we haven't got a responsibility to create an environment that everybody can thrive. But it really is what individual members of the Canadian Armed Forces, how they treat each other, the attitudes that they bring, the way in which they interact, and the values that the organization shows are the ones that are rewarded. That is what is important. And when the values are such that certain people in the Canadian Armed Forces feel that they can't contribute fully, that they're not really welcome, when there are microaggressions, when there are things that indicate every day, whether it's what is required to be in your kit, or whether it is the way your uniform fits, or if the message that is being sent, particularly to women, but also to other equity-seeking groups, if the message that is being sent every day in your day-to-day experience is that you're just being accommodated, you don't really belong here, but we'll kind of try to fit you in, as opposed to values and an attitudes and a culture where somebody is completely valued, where that person belongs there, they know that they belong there, they're not just being fit into what already exists, where the contributions of all individuals become part of the whole, part of the unit, part of the forces as a whole, and where you have leadership that isn't just about getting particular job done, but leadership that is about looking at the various skills, talents, life experiences, abilities that every member brings, and making sure that every single person who joins to serve their country is able to do so completely. That's I think what the witnesses who brought this particular recommendation, I think that is what they were talking about. And the next one is recommending approaching the issue of behavioral change in the Canadian Armed Forces with a beginning to end approach, examining new CAF members, indoctrination, course of career events, leadership development, incentives, and career advancement. And this is core to some of the things that we have heard. From the beginning, from the very first day that somebody joins the Canadian Armed Forces, all the way through their career, And this talks about the course of career events that shape the direction and the culture, the leadership development. What is a leader? And I really think that the concept of leadership, and this is not just in the Canadian Forces, we've seen this in politics, we've seen this in many different areas, and there's been a lot written about this from a feminist perspective of what is leadership. We've even seen it here in the House of Commons, where if a woman is speaking and she shows emotion, that's somehow considered weakness, that's not a real leader. And this idea that leadership has to be aggressive and masculine, as I said previously, that doesn't just hurt women, but that hurts men, because not all men are comfortable with that kind of normative, that toxic masculinity. Most men aren't, and I think that this idea that you have to fit a certain mold in order to be included, that is what we talk about when we talk about culture change. And I like the way that this particular recommendation is worded, where it says beginning to end approach. So the previous recommendation talked about behavioral change from a top to bottom approach, right? So that's a lot of what we're talking about here today. But this one talks about a beginning to end approach. And I do think that this is something that has to continue throughout a person's career. And I do have a lot of hope, because I do think that there is a lot of culture change happening, especially the younger and newer members of the Canadian Armed Forces. And I do think that kind of leadership is really the kind of leadership that we're going to need. And I'll be honest, I think that, we all who, and this applies to politics too, those of us who've been around, who are a little bit older, who've been around for a long time, we all have something to learn from the people coming up who are younger than us. I can tell you that I have 19, 20-year-old female staffers and interns who have called out things that I wouldn't have thought to call out. And I think it's because at a certain point in your life, you get almost sensitized, and you it's not that you get comfortable with something, but you hear it so much, and maybe you try and call it out, and then at a certain point it doesn't register anymore. Like it, and I think a lot of us, if those of us that are not in our 20s, let's say, they're a little bit older, a little more experienced, who've been in careers where we've sometimes, very often in my career, very often I was the only woman in the room. In fact, that was the norm more than not, that I was either the only woman or one of very few women in a room full of men. And at a certain point, it's like we learn the strategies that if you want to get things done and you want to move the dial on certain things, you just learn to ignore other things. And those are things we shouldn't ignore. Those are things we have to call out. And it really, I had to do some moments of self-reflection when some of my very young staffers say, we got to call that out. This is wrong. And then I think to myself, why is it? Why is it that I wouldn't have thought? Because as soon as you think about it, you think, yeah, you're right. We absolutely have to call that out. Why didn't it register? And I think you have that same kind of self-reflection happening with a lot of the very senior members of the Canadian Armed Forces. I think a lot of people are looking back at their careers, and these are good people who have never participated in the kinds of behaviors that we're talking about, but maybe became, and I don't want to use the word desensitized, I don't even know what word to use, but I do think that there is a major shift happening right now, and that is a good thing. And the reason it's happening is because of those who called it out. Because of those, and I'm not going to say brave or courageous women, because the ones that don't, it doesn't mean they're not brave or courageous. But I also think we all need to look at our own, what we do, and what we consider to be relevant or not relevant, what we react to or don't react to. That's all part of culture. And that's why I'm really, really pleased when I look here that it is about top down and beginning to end. The next recommendation that I have here that I've put into this category is setting a goal of consistent, timely, compassionate, and effective sexual misconduct resolution in the Canadian Armed Forces in order to achieve culture change. And what I can say, Madam Chair, is that there are a lot of people right now, and I don't think this is unique to the Canadian Armed Forces, who, and certainly when Me Too began, and certainly if you look at institutions around the world, law enforcement institutions, military, the United Nations, a lot of institutions where you have traditionally had a lot more men than women. There is a lot of self-reflection happening right now. And I think that when the wording here in this recommendation, I think is incredibly important because it is consistent, timely, compassionate, and effective sexual misconduct resolution. So it needs to be consistent because if you apply it in certain cases and not other cases, it lacks legitimacy. It needs to be timely because obviously justice delayed is justice denied. And, you know, I find it really sad that I have had people phone me and they've seen me on TV and they say, I'd like to tell you something that happened to me 40 years ago. I've never told anyone. How heartbreaking for somebody to keep something inside for decades, and feel that they can't tell anyone, not even the people in their personal lives. You know, that is at the same time heartbreaking, but also a huge responsibility. And the person and the people that have spoken, I really hope that we're doing right by you, because by speaking after 40 years, it is an even greater responsibility on us as politicians, as leaders, to make sure we get it right, to make sure that you speaking out now is not going to be for nothing, and that younger people and people who are currently serving never, ever have to go through what you went through. And this idea that it has to be timely, nobody should ever, ever again feel that they are silent for decades. I can't even imagine 30 years from now if somebody experiences something now and that they would, I mean, this has to be timely. We need to deal with it right now. Compassionate, it's an interesting choice of words. I think the reason that those that put this forward as a recommendation, the survivors that brought this forward, I think compassionate also has to understand that people do change. People go through learning curves throughout their life. People do become aware. People don't always understand the impact of their silence or the impact of what their behaviors are until it's brought to them. And good people, when they realize the impact of things that maybe were normalized for them, good people are self-reflective and want to make amends. And I think this can't just be punitive. It has to be compassionate so that people can reconcile, people can make amends. I'm not talking about the sexual assault and sexual violence, and I'm talking about, you know, the off-color jokes or looking the other way or laughing because you just want to be part of the crowd, or the things that create culture that maybe a lot of people and many people have probably experienced. There has to be a compassionate way to make amends so that those who experienced it can have closure, can move on, and so that behavior changes. And yes, some of that has to be punitive when things are when people do things to harm and hurt others. There has to be justice. But at the same time, I think there also needs to be a reckoning about how behaviors have to change so that people internalize what they've done and are able to then not only change it for themselves, but for people that are coming up behind that they're leading. And then effective, obviously, that's I think that's a given, that it has to be effective. There have been many, many attempts, and you know, we saw things like the duty to report, which were well intentioned, and I think many of us, when we talk about bystanders, we talk about those that looked the other way, and you know, that's none of my business. I'm not going to talk about it. and then the duty to report, put that obligation to report it if you see it. But the problem with that is that it took the agency away from the person who's experiencing it. And it forced that person, often women, into a timeline and a set of events that they may not have been prepared or ready for. And perhaps they might have wanted at some point, but it takes it outside of their control in how and when things get reported and how and when it is pursued. And I think what we've learned, if anything, from the recommendations, from the testimony, from the witnesses, from everybody that we've heard from, at this point, we've heard that it is actually very important that the victim, the survivor, the person impacted has that agency and decision-making capacity about how it goes forward. So that is, I think, again, a very, very thoughtful recommendation. The next recommendation that I have here is about, and this is something that we've heard a lot about in the last 4 months, addressing the failure of Operation Honor to link sexual misconduct and military culture, notably the lack of reference to the role of gender and masculinity within the Canadian Armed Forces. One of the first pieces of testimony that we heard here was the minister coming here at the very beginning and talking about toxic masculinity. And I do believe that that was the first time that a Minister of Defense in Canada has, in a public setting before Parliament, used those words toxic masculinity. And it is, I think, a vitally important milestone to recognize it. It is one thing to recognize it, it's another to actually eliminate it. And the how, that piece about how do we eliminate it, Operation Honor didn't do that. Operation Honor, as much as I do believe that there were some good things that came from it, it didn't make that link to culture. It didn't. It was, you know, as we've heard from many of the witnesses, it didn't achieve the results that it purportedly was set out to achieve. And there are many reasons for that. And we heard a lot of those reasons, and I'm not going to get into that now. But to talk about culture without talking about gender and masculinity is almost impossible, because a lot of what we're talking about, a lot of the experiences we've heard are specifically about the concepts of masculinity, the concept of gender, and the way in which most people don't conform or fit into those sort of expected gender roles. And the idea of masculinity and what is masculinity. And, you know, we heard from, I don't remember which academic it was, it might have been Dr. Okros, who told us that this idea of a warrior culture, that this is one of the last places in which we have people who may look to join, because it's one of the last, I'm quoting now, one of the last places where men can be men. And that's a really toxic thing if you think about it, because amongst men and amongst women, there are so many different sets of behaviors that trying to limit it to this one concept of masculinity is harmful to women and to men. And I think that's something that we definitely need to include in our report, something that we most certainly need to make sure that the witnesses who talked about these things and the recommendations that they've brought forward are heard. So, Madam Chair, I think I'll leave it there and let some of my colleagues continue. But I certainly have a lot more recommendations here that I really hope we'll have a chance to make sure that gets tabled in Parliament. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right. Thank you, Madame Vandenbelt. Mr. Bagnall, please. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now? Oh, sorry. So I just have a few points. One is, I was really buoyed this morning, actually, when I saw this motion, although it took a while to read it and everything. It was too bad, as usual, it came late. But Mr. Bazan has apologized for that, so I accept that. I'm sure Mr. Bazan, and I wasn't as objectionist to some others. I thought there's a way forward here. I still think there is a way forward here. And I don't think Mr. Bazan withdraw the motion on more witnesses just because it's, that it became obvious that the next witnesses should be Mr. O'Toole and Mr. McFadden and Jennifer Lawson and Guy Thibault and the head of military justice that closed the report on Mr. Vance. It was to get a way forward. He talked about, he made an interesting point about closure in the House, and I wanted to comment on that a bit. As you know, the Conservatives used closure a lot of time when they were in Parliament, but I don't blame them for that, actually, because I think there's a structural problem, and this has been brought up at PROC and never resolved. But there's a structural problem in the way the House of Commons works that leads to closure no matter who's in government. And this has been solved by other parliaments. I think the Scottish Parliament is one. But the fact is, when you've got over 50 departments and agencies and important work that needs to be done in all those areas, and a huge agenda, no matter who is going to be the government, you can't use, you have to have a plan that makes sense. And some things are very minor additions, and some things are major additions, and major, such as end of life, is a very serious type of debate and discussion. But some minor things end up, because there's no programming, there's no schedule, they take up also excessive time. So no matter who's in government, if you want to move on for the people of Canada on the many, many topics that need to be moved forward on, you will need closure. And so how other parliaments have dealt with this is the parties have get together and do programming. They decide in advance, what is serious, what needs more time. And they come up with a schedule that makes a lot of sense. And it reduces, and I think in some sittings actually totally eliminated the need for closure because they, came up with what made a lot more sense. And when the serious issues got the serious time and the minor amendments got the time they needed. So I recommend that to everyone. I want to say that, as I said before, I think there are members from all parties. There are things in the report, in either the clauses or the recommendations, where there are members from every party that wouldn't necessarily agree with them right now and would want to spend not in their debate at the 2 minutes on that. There's not very many that my gut reaction is there's not that many that are controversial, although one member did suggest that actually most of them were at one time earlier in this debate. So I think all members of all parties that have an objection where they want to speak for more than 2 minutes on a clause or a recommendation, they should do that during this debate because this motion passes. They're not going to have any other time. So I look forward to hearing all the members on what's important to them. And I'll give you an example from my perspective of something that I don't think there's enough attention to in either the report or the recommendations, and that is on reprisals. As we heard from a lot of the witnesses, that they either reported and there were reprisals to their career in reporting, or they didn't report because they were feared of reprisals in reporting. So, in the administrative directive or the code of conduct, I'm not sure if there are or strong enough condemnations of inappropriate reprisals, particularly in sexual misconduct, but it could be for anything. And so that is an example of what I think should be um, should be looked at more and have a lot more than a 2-minute discussion, because obviously it is one of the major flaws in the system, and should take more time on recommendations and in the paragraphs of the report. And the last thing I would like to do is just throw out, I just thought about this about 5 minutes ago, but having seen the motion and thought of a way forward that people might think about. And I'm not looking for a quick answer or anything. I'm sort of just thinking as I go and letting people think about this. But what if we agreed go through the paragraphs and recommendations quickly and agreed by unanimous consent which ones could be dealt with in the way Mr. Bizan is proposing, with 2 minutes per member discussing them. I think that would deal with it's hard to say, but my thought is that a lot of the report could be dealt with really quickly that way, in the way Mr. Bizan says, on particular paragraphs and recommendations that we all agreed will be dealt with in that 2-minute debate per paragraph and per recommendation, because obviously the recommendations and paragraphs have to evolve from what the witnesses said. So it can't be that inaccurate that we wouldn't come to an agreement on a lot of them. And then those few that we couldn't agree with unanimously, that they be dealt with in that process. Then we go back to them and deal with them in the regular process for clauses and recommendations. I'm just throwing that out as an idea for people to think about, and I'll turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bagnall. On to Mr. Spengeman, please.
Madam Chair, thank you again very much, and I'd like to thank my colleagues for their previous remarks. I wanted to circle back to a couple of points. One is the government response. I think it's incredibly important that we ask for a government response, and colleagues have outlined why that is. It's a question of accountability. Unless we hear from the government what its reflections are on the recommendations and the tenor of the report that we're going to put forward, we have little way of ascertaining to what extent we're actually impactful and to what extent we're going to help move the yardsticks. To use an example that I've cited already in previous interventions, the UK had its 2019 report on inappropriate behavior, as they called it, issued in July of 2019, and fairly shortly, a year later, the Right Honourable Ben Wallace, MP, Secretary of State for Defence of the United Kingdom, issued a report, Unacceptable Behaviours Progress Review 2020. Those kinds of things will happen if you ask for, or can happen if you ask for a government response. And from that experience, we see that if the right recommendations are made and put forward, positive action can follow in very short order. And I think that's really one of the issues here that we've talked about this afternoon and in previous sessions, not only the urgency of the issue that's at stake, but also the importance of making sure that we have recommendations that are actionable, that are impactful, and that aren't going to sit in a drawer or be ineffective if they are implemented. So I think the government response is important for this committee to be seized with any additional studies that it may undertake, but also for the Canadian public to see what the government actually what its reflections were and what its path forward is in response to our report. Two other points really quickly on Mr. Bizan's motion. I think one of the challenges that we've seen, it's not so much only the 2-minute restriction in itself. I mean, that's, in the sake of expediency, one can sort of follow the logic of why you would restrict time, and we do this in committee all the time when we have witnesses. We have carefully negotiated, allocated time periods. The challenge is if you say to a member, you may speak only once. because that prevents any kind of debate building on comments that were made previously by colleagues, specifically with respect to recommendations. So if a colleague has an idea of how to amend a particular recommendation and a member has already spoken, then she or he will not be able to come back in again and to sort of give reflection. So you don't get a cumulative debate that may actually get us to the same side of the issue, if not the same side of the table. So for that reason, I think it's important that we be more flexible. But bearing in mind Mr. Bazan's overall concern that we need to finish this report in short order to be able to land it. But I don't think the 2 minutes restriction, if it's framed as speaking only once, is going to be helpful in that respect. He also mentioned that this would be, and I think I'm quoting him correctly here. He'll tell me otherwise if I'm not. But he called it the easy path forward, and I think by easy he meant not necessarily to take the issue lightly. He meant the most expedient way forward. The issues, and I just want to be clear here on the record, the issues are complex, and testimony after testimony and intervention after intervention that we've heard from colleagues, and very thoughtful across party lines, I think, in some cases anyway, indicate how complex the issues are, how important they are to Canadians, but most importantly, the family of the Canadian Forces currently serving and veterans. So for that reason, I think we have to be mindful that the easy answer isn't going to cut it. An expedient answer, yes, but we are entering now into the final stage of our work, and there are complex challenges before us, coupled by complex recommendations that need to be thought through. I think it was my colleague, Mr. Bagnall, who said, complex problems that yield or that are responded to by simple answers will be faced with ultimately often the wrong answers. So we need to take the time to think this through, but expeditiously. I'd like to thank my colleague, Ms. Vandenbelt, for her most recent intervention with respect to recommendations that she put forward. And I'd like to compliment them briefly with some of the insights that are in the concluding section of the report from the UK that I had presented over a number of sessions. They relate to the topics of bystanders, recruits, social media, and transparency of action. I'd like to get them on the record again in light of the fact that if this motion passes, we will basically be truncating our discussion with respect to any additional input that may be made. The issue of bystanders is incredibly important, not only in the Canadian Forces, but in broader society. Sexual misconduct, or the elimination of sexual misconduct, really is driven by the need to really find different behavior from bystanders, be they civilian or be they serving members of armed forces. And on this point, the UK conclusions again are illuminating. The report states that recent academic research refers widely to the role of bystanders in influencing behavior in groups. Everyone is a bystander. We witness events unfolding around us constantly. Sometimes we recognize events as being problematic, and we may decide to intervene and become an active bystander, or not, and remain a passive bystander. There are many factors which will influence why we decide to intervene or not, but when we do decide to intervene, we are sending a clear message to the wrongdoer that their behavior is unacceptable. So the UK are drawing attention to the need to change bystander behavior within both the civilian and military elements of their armed forces. The report cites a quote by Edmund Burke, who wrote in the mid to late 1700s. The quote is that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. Appreciating when this quote was written will lead to an understanding of the fact that this is not gender neutral language, but perhaps importantly with respect to this issue here, really it is the behavior of men in large part. That's a question. It's also the question of male allies. Again, the status quo will maintain if people don't act, and bystanders, I think, have a particular role. In empowering active bystanders, skills development and the creation of supporting challenges and reporting mechanisms are critical to the success of introducing effective intervention programs. Several valid and reliable proprietary bystander intervention programs exist, but all such programs require significant investment in training and education at all levels of the organization. Bystander education equips people with the knowledge, skills, and confidence to intervene, to challenge inappropriate behavior, to call it out, and to report it. The Defense Academy Active Bystander Intervention Program is judged a leading practice in this regard. So these are the observations of the United Kingdom reports on the question of bystanders. They recommend to investigate, develop, and implement appropriate bystander training across defense. And that's a recommendation that complements my comments, the comments that were made by Ms. Vanden Belt in her previous intervention. This section goes on to recognize that more data may be required from recruits. And in this respect, the UK report actually refers to us and the Canadian Forces work, stating that the Canadian Armed Forces are considering whether or not to gather additional information on recruits to have a better idea of the values, attitudes, and standards they possess on joining, to assess risk and protective factors, and therefore better tailor and focus training. We recommend consideration of the same. The message back to us here is that as we develop this report, other countries are going to look to us, and in fact are already looking to us with respect to what we do. So there's a heightened attention here that's signaled by the UK on our work or our potential steps with respect to gathering information on new recruits. Something I feel that the committee should be mindful of as we develop our report. It's this granularity and this kind of interaction between us and other jurisdictions through the work that we do that requires some consideration and debate on our behalf, not just in the sense of having the opportunity to intervene for 2 minutes without necessarily building on comments of other members. But I think more systematically, we need the freedom to interact among each other to figure out what the right answers are, especially when it comes to the integration of the work that's already being done in other jurisdictions. So the recommendation by the UK here is that consideration should be given to gathering additional values, attitudes, and standards of information on new recruits to assess the risk and to tailor preventative training. On social media, the UK makes a comment that perhaps requires some consideration on our part, especially in light of what Ms. Vanden Belt earlier said about young people and social media. A widely acknowledged behavioral challenge is the increase in the transmission of social media messages with asexual content. Whilst efforts should focus on this area, it is recognized that this is a part of broader societal challenges. Although there's an expectation that the more junior cohorts are more familiar with social media and online activity, some focus group feedback has suggested that this cohort, described as digital natives, do in fact require some training and education surrounding their conduct online. This takes us into a broader conversation in the civil sector with respect to online bullying, harassment, and misconduct. And perhaps we should turn our minds to this in a more thoughtful manner than the UK has had the opportunity to do here. It's a simple one-paragraph statement, but we may want to elaborate this in light of the work that many of us are engaged in at the parliamentary level outside of the Canadian Forces with respect to online harassment, online hate, and the work that we're doing in that regard, and feeding that back into the recommendations that we're making with respect to social media messages by current or former members of the Canadian Forces. And then finally, Madam Chair, there's a heading on transparency of action, and this is fundamental in the sense that transparency of action needs to be communicated and evident to all service personnel and civil servants. This should include greater transparency of the consequences for perpetrators, to bring to life the policy of zero tolerance, energize values and standards, and tackle elements of organizational cynicism that action does not get taken. Culture and behaviors and the consequences for victims and or perpetrators need to feature as a routine conversation in the workplace and throughout the training provision, must be consistent and persistent. And this section of the report concludes there with a call for authentic leadership, relentless engagement, and consistent communication across the UK forces. Bystander training, immersive role-playing training, and social media training are all good examples of programs we recommend should be implemented across defense. This will require concerted effort, resource, and persistent attention over many years by defense senior leadership and leaders and line managers at every level. Again, Madam Chair, over the course of the interventions I've made so far on just the British experience alone, I indicated there are experiences from other countries that the committee may wish to consider or at least take note of. There's a granularity here that can catalyze our work. I know our time is short, but by looking to what was done already elsewhere and what was done successfully, we not only step to the side of our allies around the world that are facing the same problem, but we signal to Canadians that this is an issue that far, far exceeds our boundaries, our borders, that is systematic in nature, that is based on the way militaries have acted generationally for too long, and that the culture change really is a much more multilateral, if not global one, that's required in areas like peacekeeping and deployments around the world that Canadian forces are part of. I'll leave it there for the moment, Madam Chair, and turn it over to
Meeting
Chair.
is suspended.
Point of order.